In the affluent city of Guarapuava, Paraná, Brazil, there lived a successful lawyer whose life would end in one of the most shocking and well-documented cases of domestic violence in Brazilian history. Tatiane Spitzner was a 29-year-old attorney with a promising career, a beautiful home, and what appeared to be a loving marriage to Luís Felipe Manvailer, a successful businessman 7 years her senior. But behind the facade of their seemingly perfect life lay a dark reality of escalating abuse, control, and violence that would ultimately cost Tatiane her life. On July 22, 2018, security cameras in their luxury apartment building would capture the horrifying final moments of Tatiane's life, recording her husband's brutal assault and her desperate attempts to escape before he ultimately threw her from their fourth-floor balcony. The footage of Tatiane's murder would shock Brazil and the world, providing undeniable evidence of the deadly reality of domestic violence and sparking national conversations about femicide victim blaming and the urgent need for better protection of women in abusive relationships. The images were so disturbing and the evidence so clear that the case would become a watershed moment in Brazil's understanding of domestic violence. This wasn't just another tragic case of domestic violence. It was a crime captured in real time by multiple security cameras, providing investigators and the public with an unfiltered view of how quickly a domestic dispute can escalate to murder. The footage would eliminate any possibility of claiming self-defense or accidental death, showing clearly that Tatiane was the victim of a calculated and brutal attack by the man who had promised to love and protect her. Tatiane Spitzner's case would expose the insidious nature of domestic abuse among educated, affluent couples and would challenge stereotypes about who can be a victim of domestic violence. Her story would become a rallying cry for women's rights advocates and would inspire changes in Brazilian law and police procedures for handling domestic violence cases. The man who killed Tatiane was not a stranger lurking in the shadows, but her husband of 4 years, someone she had trusted with her life and her future. Luís Felipe Manvailer was a respected businessman in their community, known for his charm and success, but the security camera footage would reveal his true nature as a violent predator who had been escalating his abuse, until it reached its deadly conclusion. This is the story of Tatiane Spitzner, a brilliant woman whose life was cut short by domestic violence, and whose death was captured on camera, in such graphic detail that it would force an entire nation to confront the reality of what happens behind closed doors in abusive relationships. Her case would become one of the most important domestic violence cases in Brazilian legal history, not just because of its brutality, but because the evidence was so clear and undeniable that it would change how society views and responds to domestic abuse. If you think you understand the dynamics of domestic violence and the escalation patterns that lead to murder, you're about to witness a case where every moment of that escalation was captured on camera, providing an unprecedented look into the final hours of a woman who died trying to escape the man who claimed to love her. The successful lawyer, Tatiane Spitzner, was born on March 8, 1989, in Guarapuava, a prosperous city in the interior of Paraná state known for its agricultural wealth and growing business community. She came from a middle-class family that valued education and hard work, with parents who had built successful careers and instilled in their daughter the importance of independence and professional achievement. From an early age, Tatiane displayed exceptional intelligence and a natural aptitude for academics. She excelled in school, consistently ranking among the top students in her class and showing particular talent in languages, literature, and social sciences. Her teachers recognized her potential and encouraged her to pursue higher education, seeing in her the qualities of a future leader and professional. Tatiane's decision to study law was influenced by her desire to help others and her fascination with the Brazilian legal system. She enrolled at the Universidade Estadual do Centro-Oeste, Unicentro, in Guarapuava, where she quickly established herself as a dedicated and talented student. Her professors remembered her as someone who asked thoughtful questions, participated actively in class discussions, and showed genuine passion for justice and legal advocacy. During her university years, Tatiane worked part-time at local law firms, gaining practical experience while completing her studies. She was particularly interested in family law and civil rights, areas where she felt she could make a real difference in people's lives. Her supervisors consistently praised her work ethic, attention to detail, and natural ability to connect with clients who were often going through the most difficult periods of their lives. After graduating with honors in 2012, Tatiane began working as an associate at a respected law firm in Guarapuava city center. She specialized in family law, civil litigation, and women's rights cases, handling matters ranging from divorce proceedings to domestic violence protection orders. Her colleagues described her as brilliant, compassionate, and completely dedicated to her clients' welfare. Tatiane's professional reputation grew quickly in Guarapuava's legal community. She was known for her thorough preparation, her persuasive courtroom presence, and her unwavering commitment to fighting for her clients' rights. She had a particular talent for handling sensitive family law cases, where her combination of legal expertise and emotional intelligence made her especially effective. By 2014, Tatiane had established herself as one of the rising stars in Guarapuava's legal community. She was earning a substantial income, had built a network of professional contacts throughout Paraná state, and was considering starting her own practice. Her personal life seemed equally fulfilling. She maintained close relationships with her family, had a circle of loyal friends, and enjoyed traveling, reading, and participating in cultural events. Tatiane was also known for her independence and strong personality. She was not someone who compromised her values or allowed others to control her decisions. Friends described her as confident, assertive, and unwilling to tolerate disrespect or manipulation. These qualities, which served her well in her professional life, would later become sources of conflict in her marriage to Luís Felipe. In her personal relationships, Tatiane was selective and cautious. She had dated several men over the years, but had never found someone who truly understood and supported her professional ambitions. She was looking for a partner who would respect her independence and treat her as an equal, someone who understood that her career was as important to her as any romantic relationship. When Tatiane met Luís Felipe Manvailer and Arlene Sen, she was initially attracted to his confidence, his business success, and his apparent respect for her accomplishments. He seemed different from other men she had dated, more mature, more established in his career, and more supportive of her professional goals. He presented himself as a modern, enlightened man who valued strong, independent women. What Tatiane didn't realize was that beneath Luís Felipe's charming exterior lay a deeply troubled man with serious issues related to control, jealousy, and possessiveness. The qualities that had made her successful in her career, her independence, her strong will, and her refusal to be controlled, would eventually trigger the violent behavior that would cost her life. The businessman, Luís Felipe Manvailer, was born on September 12, 1982, in Guarapuava, into a family with significant business interests in the region's agricultural and commercial sectors. His father owned several successful enterprises, including agricultural equipment, dealerships, and real estate investments, providing the family with considerable wealth and social status in the community. From childhood, Luís Felipe was groomed to take over the family business empire. He attended the best private schools in Guarapuava, where he was known more for his family's wealth and influence than for his academic achievements. Teachers and classmates remembered him as someone who expected special treatment and became angry when he didn't receive the deference he felt he deserved. Despite his privileged upbringing, Luís Felipe struggled with feelings of inadequacy and insecurity that he masked behind a facade of confidence and entitlement. He was particularly sensitive about his intelligence and education, aware that he lacked the academic credentials that many of his peers possessed. This insecurity would later manifest as jealousy and resentment toward Tatiane's professional success. Luís Felipe's relationship with women followed a disturbing pattern that would become more pronounced over time. He was attracted to successful, independent women, but once in relationships, he became increasingly controlling and possessive. He would use his wealth and family connections to impress women initially, but would gradually attempt to isolate them from their friends and careers. Several of Luís Felipe's former girlfriends would later describe similar experiences. Relationships that began with lavish gifts and romantic gestures, but gradually became suffocating and frightening. He would monitor their activities, question their friendships, and become jealous of their professional achievements. When women tried to assert their independence, he would respond with manipulation, threats, or violence. One former girlfriend, who spoke anonymously to investigators after Tatiane's death, described Luís Felipe as charming at first, but then he became like a prison guard. He wanted to control every aspect of my life, where I went, who I talked to, what I wore. When I tried to break up with him, he threatened to ruin my reputation and my family's business. By the time Luís Felipe met Tatiane in 2013, he had developed sophisticated methods of control and manipulation. He had learned to present himself as the ideal boyfriend, successful, generous, and supportive, while gradually isolating his partners from their support systems. He was particularly skilled at identifying successful women who might be vulnerable to his attention and apparent stability. Luís Felipe's business ventures were largely funded by his family's wealth, rather than his own entrepreneurial skills. He owned several small companies in Guarapuava, including a construction firm and a restaurant. But these businesses were more about maintaining his image as a successful entrepreneur than generating significant profits. His real income came from his family's investments and properties. The control and manipulation that characterized Luís Felipe's personal relationships also extended to his business dealings. He had a reputation for being difficult to work with, demanding absolute loyalty from employees, and becoming vindictive toward anyone who crossed him. Several former business partners described him as someone who used intimidation and threats to get his way. Luís Felipe's attraction to Tatiane was immediate and intense, but it was based more on possession than genuine love. Here was a woman who represented everything he wanted but felt he could unachieve on his own: education, professional success, respect in the community, and intellectual accomplishment. In his mind, winning Tatiane's love would validate his worth and elevate his own status. But Luís Felipe's feelings for Tatiane were not healthy or genuine. They were possessive, obsessive, and ultimately destructive. He saw her not as an independent person with her own goals and desires, but as a trophy to be won and controlled. When she eventually tried to assert her independence and escape his control, his obsession would transform into the deadly rage that would cost her life. The warning signs of Luís Felipe's potential for violence were there from the beginning of his relationship with Tatiane, but they were subtle and gradually escalating. His controlling behavior was initially masked as concern and protection, his jealousy presented as evidence of his love, and his manipulation disguised as romantic devotion. By the time the true nature of his character became apparent, Tatiane was already trapped in a relationship that would ultimately prove fatal. The courtship and marriage. Tatiane and Luís Felipe met in September 2013 at a professional networking event in Garapoava, where lawyers, business people, and other professionals gathered to discuss economic development in the region. Luís Felipe was immediately drawn to Tatiane's intelligence, beauty, and professional success. While she was initially impressed by his apparent business acumen, his confident demeanor, and his knowledge of the local commercial community, their early courtship followed a pattern that would later be recognized as typical of relationships that eventually become abusive. Luís Felipe was charming, attentive, and seemingly devoted to Tatiane's happiness. He would surprise her with expensive gifts, take her to the finest restaurants in the region, and constantly tell her how special and beautiful she was. He appeared to be genuinely interested in her career and would ask detailed questions about her cases and professional goals. Tatiane's friends and family initially approved of the relationship. Luís Felipe presented himself as a successful, stable man who clearly adored Tatiane and seemed committed to building a future with her. He was polite to her parents, respectful to her friends, and appeared to support her professional ambitions. To outside observers, they seemed like a perfect match, two successful professionals who complemented each other well. However, subtle signs of Luís Felipe's controlling nature began to emerge within the first few months of their relationship. He would call Tatiane multiple times throughout the day, ostensibly to check on her well-being but actually to monitor her activities. He would ask detailed questions about her interactions with male colleagues and clients, expressing concern about her safety in ways that seemed caring but were actually possessive. Luís Felipe also began to insert himself into Tatiane's professional life in ways that made her uncomfortable. He would offer to provide security for her when she had to work late or meet with difficult clients. He would suggest that certain male colleagues or clients might have inappropriate intentions toward her, planting seeds of doubt and paranoia that served to isolate her from her professional network. As the relationship progressed, Luís Felipe's behavior became more overtly controlling. He would show up at Tatiane's office unannounced, claiming he was in the neighborhood but actually checking to see if she was where she said she would be. He would go through her phone when she wasn't looking, questioning her about text messages and phone calls from friends and colleagues. Tatiane began to feel suffocated by Luís Felipe's constant attention and surveillance. She tried to address the issue with him directly, explaining that she needed space and independence to maintain her professional effectiveness. Luís Felipe would apologize and promise to change, but his behavior would inevitably return to the same controlling patterns. Despite these warning signs, Tatiane's feelings for Luís Felipe were genuine, and she believed that his behavior stemmed from insecurity rather than malice. She thought that with time and patience, she could help him overcome his jealousy and possessiveness. She also felt pressure from family and friends who saw Luís Felipe as an ideal husband and could understand why she seemed unhappy in such a perfect relationship. The couple became engaged in December 2013, just 3 months after meeting. Luís Felipe proposed with an expensive diamond ring during a romantic dinner at an exclusive restaurant, and Tatiane accepted despite her growing concerns about his controlling behavior. She hoped that marriage would provide the security and commitment that might help him overcome his jealousy. Their wedding took place on February 14, 2014, Valentine's Day, in an elaborate ceremony at one of Garapoava's most prestigious venues. The event was attended by hundreds of guests from the legal, business, and social communities, and was featured prominently in the local society pages. To all appearances, it was the wedding of two successful, attractive people who were deeply in love. But even on their wedding day, there were signs of the problems that would eventually destroy their marriage. Several guests later recalled that Luís Felipe seemed possessive and controlling, rarely leaving Tatiane's side and appearing uncomfortable when she spoke with other guests, particularly men. He monitored her interactions throughout the reception and seemed to view her attention to others as a personal slight. The honeymoon period was brief. Within weeks of their marriage, Luís Felipe's controlling behavior escalated dramatically. He began making demands about Tatiane's work schedule, her social activities, and even her appearance. He wanted her to reduce her caseload, limit her interactions with male colleagues, and spend more time at home with him. Tatiane resisted these demands, explaining that her career was important to her and that she had worked too hard to build her practice to abandon it for marriage. This resistance triggered increasingly aggressive responses from Luís Felipe, who began to see her professional success as a threat to his authority and control over their relationship. The escalation of abuse. The first year of Tatiane and Luís Felipe, marriage was marked by a gradual but steady escalation of controlling and abusive behavior that would eventually culminate in violence. What had begun as seemingly caring concern for Tatiane's welfare evolved into systematic psychological abuse designed to isolate her from her support systems and make her completely dependent on her husband. Luís Felipe's control tactics became more sophisticated and comprehensive as time went on. He began monitoring Tatiane's finances, demanding access to her bank accounts and questioning every expenditure. He would criticize her spending on professional clothing, continuing education, and social activities, claiming that she was being irresponsible with their money, even though she was earning a substantial income from her legal practice. The psychological abuse intensified as Luís Felipe began systematically undermining Tatiane's confidence and self-esteem. He would criticize her appearance, her intelligence, and her professional abilities, often in subtle ways that left her questioning her own judgment. He would make disparaging comments about her clients, her colleagues, and her career choices, gradually convincing her that she was lucky to have him and that no one else would want her. Luís Felipe also began isolating Tatiane from her friends and family through a combination of manipulation and direct interference. He would create conflicts with her friends by being rude or inappropriate when they visited, making it uncomfortable for them to spend time with Tatiane. He would schedule activities or create emergencies that prevented her from attending social events or family gatherings. When Tatiane's friends expressed concern about the changes they were seeing in her behavior and appearance, Luís Felipe would intercept their communications and respond on her behalf, claiming that she was too busy or stressed to maintain her previous social relationships. He gradually succeeded in cutting her off from most of her support network, leaving her increasingly isolated and dependent on him. The first incidents of physical violence occurred in late 2014, about 10 months after their wedding. These initial episodes were relatively minor, pushing, grabbing, or restraining Tatiane during arguments, but they established a pattern of escalation that would continue throughout their marriage. Luís Felipe would always apologize afterward, claiming that he had been stressed or that Tatiane had provoked him, and promising that it would never happen again. Tatiane's response to the early violence was typical of many domestic abuse victims. She minimized the incidents, made excuses for Luís Felipe's behavior, and convinced herself that she could help him change. She was also influenced by societal messages about marriage and commitment, feeling that she should try to work through their problems rather than give up on the relationship. The abuse followed a classic cycle that would repeat with increasing frequency and intensity over the following years. Tension would build as Luís Felipe became increasingly controlling and critical, leading to an explosive incident of violence. This would be followed by a period of remorse and reconciliation, during which he would apologize, promise to change, and temporarily return to the charming behavior that had characterized their early relationship. Each cycle of abuse was worse than the last, with the violence becoming more severe and the periods of reconciliation becoming shorter. Luís Felipe began using weapons to threaten Tatiane, including knives from their kitchen and, on at least one occasion, a gun that he kept in their home. He would also threaten to harm her family members or destroy her career if she tried to leave him. The psychological impact of the ongoing abuse was devastating for Tatiane. She became increasingly anxious, depressed, and isolated, losing weight, and developing health problems related to chronic stress. Her work performance began to suffer as she struggled to concentrate and maintain her previous level of professional effectiveness. Tatiane made several attempts to seek help during this period, but each effort was thwarted by Luís Felipe's manipulation and control. When she tried to confide in family members, he would intercept their communications and convince them that she was exaggerating or that their marriage was going through a normal rough patch. When she considered seeking professional help, he would threaten to harm himself or her if she revealed their private problems to outsiders. The abuse was not constant, which made it even more psychologically damaging. Luís Felipe would alternate between periods of extreme cruelty and moments of apparent love and affection, creating a trauma bond that made it difficult for Tatiane to leave. She would cling to the hope that the man she had fallen in love with was still there and that their marriage could be saved. By 2016, the abuse had become so severe and frequent that Tatiane was living in a state of constant fear. She had lost most of her friends, was estranged from much of her family, and was struggling to maintain her legal practice. She was trapped in a relationship that was slowly destroying her, but she felt powerless to escape because of Luís Felipe's threats and her own psychological trauma. The final escalation would come in 2018, when Tatiane finally found the courage to try to leave her abusive marriage. But by then, Luís Felipe's obsession and need for control had reached such dangerous levels that her attempt to escape would trigger the violent rage that would cost her life. The final months, the beginning of 2018, marked a turning point in Tatiane and Luís Felipe's marriage. As the abuse reached levels that even Tatiane could no longer rationalize or endure, the violence had become more frequent and more severe, with Luís Felipe's attacks leaving visible bruises and injuries that she struggled to hide from colleagues and clients. The psychological abuse had also intensified, with constant threats, surveillance, and degradation that left her feeling completely powerless and isolated. Tatiane's professional life, which had once been her source of pride and independence, was suffering dramatically under the stress of the ongoing abuse. She was having difficulty concentrating on her cases, was frequently absent from court appearances, and had lost several important clients due to her inability to provide the level of service they expected. Her colleagues noticed the changes in her behavior and appearance but were unsure how to help or whether their concerns were welcome. In March 2018, Tatiane suffered a particularly severe beating that left her with a black eye, bruised ribs, and cuts on her face and arms. The incident occurred after she had worked late on a case without informing Luís Felipe of her exact whereabouts, triggering his rage about her disobedience and disrespect. This attack was so brutal that Tatiane was forced to take time off from work to allow her injuries to heal. It was during this recovery period that Tatiane began to seriously consider leaving her marriage. She started researching domestic violence resources, looking into legal options for divorce and protection orders, and quietly reaching out to old friends and family members from whom she had been estranged. She began to understand that her situation was not normal and that she was not responsible for Luís Felipe's violence. Tatiane's first concrete step toward escape came in April 2018, when she secretly opened a new bank account and began transferring small amounts of money to create an emergency fund. She also started keeping copies of important documents in a safety deposit box and began documenting the abuse by photographing her injuries and keeping a journal of violent incidents. However, Luís Felipe's surveillance of Tatiane was so comprehensive that he quickly became aware of her preparations to leave. He discovered her secret bank account, found her hidden documents, and read her journal detailing his abuse. Rather than recognizing this as evidence that his behavior was unacceptable, he saw it as betrayal and began planning how to prevent her from escaping his control. The discovery of Tatiane's escape preparations triggered an escalation in Luís Felipe's abuse that was more severe than anything she had previously experienced. He became violent almost daily, threatening to kill her if she tried to leave, and promising to destroy her career and reputation if she sought help from authorities. He also threatened to harm her family members, making it clear that her attempt to escape would have consequences for everyone she cared about. In May 2018, Tatiane made her first formal attempt to seek help by contacting a domestic violence hotline. The counselor she spoke with encouraged her to develop a safety plan and offered to connect her with local resources, including shelters and legal assistance. However, when Luís Felipe discovered the phone call by checking her call history, he became so enraged that he attacked her with a kitchen knife, leaving cuts on her arms and threatening to kill her if she ever contacted outside help again. Despite the escalating danger, Tatiane continued to plan her escape throughout the spring and early summer of 2018. She knew that leaving would be the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship, but she also understood that staying would likely result in her death. She began varying her routines, staying late at work when possible, and looking for opportunities to implement her escape plan safely. The final crisis in their marriage began in early July 2018, when Tatiane discovered that Luís Felipe had been monitoring her electronic communications and had installed tracking software on her phone and computer. This violation of her privacy was the last straw, and she decided that she could no longer delay her escape, regardless of the risks involved. On July 15, 2018, exactly 1 week before her death, Tatiane had a conversation with her sister in which she expressed her intention to leave Luís Felipe and asked for help in implementing her escape plan. She explained that she was afraid for her life, but that she could no longer continue living in fear and isolation. Her sister agreed to help, and they began making concrete plans for Tatiane to leave the marriage. What neither Tatiane nor her sister realized was that Luís Felipe had been monitoring this conversation through the surveillance software he had installed on Tatiane's devices. He knew that she was planning to leave him, and he had already decided that if he couldn't have her, no one could. The stage was set for the final, deadly confrontation that would occur 1 week later. The final day, July 22, 2018, began like many other days in the troubled marriage of Tatiane and Luís Felipe, with tension and conflict that had become the norm in their household. But this day would be different. It would be the last day of Tatiane's life, and every moment of the final hours would be captured by the security cameras in their luxury apartment building, providing an unprecedented record of how domestic violence can escalate to murder. The couple had been arguing for several days about Tatiane's work schedule and her interactions with colleagues. Luís Felipe had become increasingly paranoid and controlling, convinced that Tatiane was planning to leave him and possibly having an affair with a male colleague. His surveillance of her communications had revealed her conversations with her sister about escape plans, and his rage had been building toward a dangerous climax. That morning, Tatiane had tried to maintain her normal routine, getting dressed for work and preparing to leave for the law office. However, Luís Felipe had other plans. He had decided that this would be the day he would finally assert complete control over his wife, and he was prepared to use whatever force was necessary to prevent her from leaving him. The first sign of trouble came when Tatiane attempted to leave for work around downtime centered. Luís Felipe blocked her path to the door, demanding that she stay home to discuss their marriage problems. when Tatiane insisted that she had important meetings and could not miss work. He became aggressive, grabbing her arm and pushing her back into their apartment. Security cameras in the building's hallway captured the beginning of this confrontation, showing Luís Felipe physically preventing Tatiane from leaving their apartment. The footage shows her trying to reason with him, attempting to calm him down and convince him to let her go to work. But his body language and aggressive posture make it clear that he has no intention of allowing her to leave. Throughout the morning and early afternoon, neighbors in the building reported hearing loud arguing, shouting, and what sounded like furniture being thrown around in the Manvailer apartment. Several residents considered calling the police but ultimately decided not to get involved in what they assumed was a domestic dispute that would resolve itself. Around 2 p.m., security cameras captured Tatiane attempting to leave the apartment again, this time appearing disheveled and frightened. She had managed to reach the elevator, but Luís Felipe followed her and forced her back to their apartment before the elevator doors could close. The footage shows her pleading with him and trying to resist his efforts to drag her back, but she was no match for his physical strength. The final confrontation began around 4:30 p.m., when Tatiane made one last desperate attempt to escape from her abusive husband. Security cameras captured her running toward the elevator, clearly in a state of panic and terror. She was partially dressed and appeared to have been injured, with visible marks on her face and arms that suggested she had been beaten. Luís Felipe pursued Tatiane into the hallway, catching her before she could reach the elevator. The security footage shows him grabbing her violently and dragging her back toward their apartment while she screamed for help. Her cries for assistance were captured on the audio portion of the security system, providing heartbreaking evidence of her desperation and fear. What happened next was captured in graphic detail by multiple security cameras positioned throughout the building. The footage shows Luís Felipe forcing Tatiane back into their apartment, where the violence escalated to levels that would ultimately prove fatal. The cameras captured the sounds of the assault, including Tatiane's screams and pleas for mercy, as well as the sounds of impact and destruction. The final, most horrifying moments of Tatiane's life were captured by a security camera positioned to monitor the building's exterior. At approximately 5:15 p.m., the camera recorded Luís Felipe throwing Tatiane's body from their fourth-floor balcony, sending her plummeting to the ground below. The footage shows her falling through the air before impacting the concrete courtyard of the building. Immediately after throwing Tatiane from the balcony, Luís Felipe was captured on camera looking down at her body and then calmly walking back into the apartment. His demeanor in the footage is chilling. He shows no emotion, no panic, and no apparent concern for what he has just done. He appears to be calculating his next moves rather than reacting to the horror of having just murdered his wife. The security camera footage of Tatiane's murder would become crucial evidence in the prosecution of Luís Felipe, providing undeniable proof of his guilt and eliminating any possibility of claiming self-defense or accidental death. The images were so clear and the evidence so overwhelming that there could be no doubt about what had occurred in those final tragic moments of Tatiane's life. The immediate aftermath, the discovery of Tatiane's body in the courtyard of their apartment, building at approximately 5:20 p.m. on July 22, 2018, triggered an immediate emergency response that would quickly evolve into one of the most high-profile domestic violence investigations in Brazilian history. The first person to find Tatiane was a building maintenance worker who had heard the impact and went to investigate. Discovering her broken body on the concrete below the fourth-floor balcony, paramedics arrived within minutes of the emergency call, but it was immediately apparent that Tatiane's injuries were fatal. She had suffered massive trauma from the fourth-story fall, including severe head injuries, multiple fractures, and internal bleeding. The paramedics pronounced her dead at the scene, and the area was immediately secured as a crime scene by the responding police officers. Detective Captain Carlos Mendes of the Garapuava Civil Police was assigned to lead the investigation. An experienced investigator with over 20 years of experience in homicide cases, Mendes immediately recognized that this was likely a case of domestic violence rather than suicide or accidental death. The circumstances of the fall, combined with reports from neighbors about ongoing domestic disputes, suggested that Tatiane had been murdered by her husband. When police officers went to the Manvailer apartment to notify Luís Felipe of his wife's death and conduct an initial interview, they found him calm and composed, showing little emotion about the tragic news. His demeanor was so unusual for someone whose wife had just died that it immediately raised suspicions among the responding officers. Luís Felipe's initial account of what had happened was that he and Tatiane had been arguing about their marriage problems, and that she had become increasingly upset and distraught. According to his version of events, Tatiane had threatened to kill herself and had run onto the balcony before he could stop her. He claimed that she had jumped to her death in a moment of desperation and that he had been unable to prevent her suicide. However, this account was immediately contradicted by the evidence that investigators began collecting at the scene. Tatiane's injuries were inconsistent with a suicide jump, and the positioning of her body suggested that she had been thrown rather than having jumped voluntarily. Additionally, the apartment showed signs of a violent struggle, with furniture overturned and blood evidence that indicated a physical altercation had taken place. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators discovered that the apartment building was equipped with an extensive security camera system that had captured the entire sequence of events leading up to Tatiane's death. The footage provided investigators with an unprecedented record of the domestic violence incident, showing clearly that Tatiane had been trying to escape from her husband and that she had been murdered rather than having committed suicide. Detective Mendez and his team spent the evening of July 22 reviewing the security camera footage, which provided a complete timeline of the events leading up to Tatiane's death. The images were so clear and the evidence so overwhelming that investigators knew they had an airtight case against Luís Felipe. The footage eliminated any possibility of claiming self-defense, accident, or suicide. When confronted with the security camera evidence on the morning of July 23, Luís Felipe's story began to change. He continued to deny intentionally killing Tatiane, but his explanations for the evidence became increasingly implausible and contradictory. His calm demeanor also began to crack as he realized that the video evidence made it impossible to maintain his claims of innocence. The arrest warrant for Luís Felipe was issued on July 23, less than 24 hours after Tatiane's death. He was charged with qualified homicide, with aggravating factors including domestic violence, cruelty, and the use of a method that prevented the victim from defending herself. The charges carried a potential sentence of life in prison under Brazilian law. News of Tatiane's murder and the existence of security camera footage spread rapidly through Guarapuava and beyond, generating intense media attention and public outrage. The case became a symbol of the epidemic of domestic violence in Brazil and sparked national conversations about the need for better protection of women in abusive relationships. The security camera footage, while crucial for the prosecution, was so disturbing that authorities decided to limit its public release. Only edited portions of the video were shown to the media. But even these brief clips were enough to shock viewers and generate widespread condemnation of domestic violence. The investigation into Tatiane's murder was one of the most comprehensive and well-documented domestic violence cases in Brazilian legal history, aided by the unprecedented security camera footage that captured the entire sequence of events leading to her death. Detective Captain Carlos Mendez and his team worked methodically to build an airtight case against Luís Felipe, knowing that the high-profile nature of the case would require flawless evidence collection and presentation. The security camera footage provided investigators with a complete timeline of the events on July 22, 2018, but the investigation extended far beyond that single day. Detectives worked to document the history of abuse in the Manvailer marriage, interviewing neighbors, friends, family members, and colleagues who had witnessed signs of domestic violence over the years. Medical records revealed a pattern of injuries consistent with ongoing physical abuse. Tatiane had sought treatment for various injuries over the previous 4 years, including bruises, cuts, and fractures that she had attributed to accidents or clumsiness. Medical professionals who had treated her came forward to report their suspicions that her injuries were the result of domestic violence. The investigation also revealed that Tatiane had been planning to leave her abusive marriage and had been taking steps to escape safely. Investigators found evidence of her secret bank account, her hidden documents, and her communications with family members about developing an escape plan. This evidence demonstrated that she had been trying to save her own life, not end it. Digital forensics experts analyzed Luís Felipe's electronic devices and discovered extensive evidence of his surveillance and control of Tatiane. They found tracking software that he had installed on her phone and computer, records of his monitoring of her communications, and evidence that he had been aware of her plans to leave the marriage. The forensic examination of the apartment revealed extensive evidence of the violent struggle that had taken place before Tatiane's death. Blood evidence, damaged furniture, and other physical evidence corroborated the security camera footage and contradicted Luís Felipe's claims that Tatiane had jumped voluntarily from the balcony. Investigators also discovered that Luís Felipe had been researching methods of murder and had been accessing information about domestic violence cases and their legal outcomes. His internet search history revealed queries about how to make murders appear to be suicides and how to avoid detection in domestic violence cases. The autopsy conducted by Dr. Patricia Santos revealed that Tatiane had suffered extensive injuries before her fall from the balcony. She had been severely beaten, with injuries to her head, face, and body that were consistent with being punched, kicked, and struck with objects. These injuries proved that she had been tortured before being thrown to her death. Ballistics and trajectory analysis of Tatiane's fall confirmed that she had been thrown from the balcony. Rather than having jumped voluntarily, the angle and force of her impact were consistent with being pushed or thrown by another person, and the positioning of her body ruled out the possibility of suicide. Witnesses came forward to describe Luís Felipe's increasingly erratic and violent behavior in the weeks leading up to the murder. Neighbors reported hearing frequent arguments, sounds of violence, and Tatiane's cries for help. Several people admitted that they had considered calling police but had decided not to get involved. in what they assumed was a private domestic matter. The investigation also revealed that Luís Felipe had been making threats against Tatiane's family members and had been planning to harm others if she tried to leave him. He had compiled information about her relatives and had made statements suggesting that he would kill anyone who tried to help her escape from their marriage. Financial records showed that Luís Felipe had been controlling Tatiane's income and had been using economic abuse as another method of maintaining control over her. He had access to her bank accounts, had been monitoring her spending, and had been preventing her from accessing funds that would have allowed her to leave safely. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Tatiane's murder was not a spontaneous act of violence but the culmination of years of escalating abuse and control. Luís Felipe had been systematically destroying his wife's independence, isolating her from support systems, and preparing to kill her if she tried to escape his control. The evidence collected during the investigation painted a picture of a calculating and dangerous predator who had used his position as Tatiane's husband to systematically abuse and ultimately murder her. The security camera footage provided undeniable proof of his guilt, but the broader investigation revealed the full scope of his crimes against his wife. The media storm, the release of edited portions of the security camera footage showing Tatiane's final moments created an unprecedented media storm that would transform her case from a local crime story into a national symbol of domestic violence in Brazil. The images were so shocking and the evidence so clear that they forced the entire country to confront the reality of what happens behind closed doors in abusive relationships. Major television networks, newspapers, and online media outlets provided extensive coverage of the case, with many organizations using Tatiane's story to launch broader discussions about domestic violence, femicide, and the protection of women in Brazil. The security camera footage, even in its edited form, was so powerful that it became impossible for viewers to deny the reality of domestic abuse or to blame the victim for her own death. The hashtag #JUSTICA para TATIANE Justice for Tatiane began trending on social media platforms within hours of the story breaking, with thousands of users sharing their own experiences of domestic violence and calling for stronger laws and better protection for women. The case became a rallying point for women's rights advocates and domestic violence prevention organizations throughout Brazil. However, the intense media coverage also brought challenges and controversies. Some critics argued that showing even edited portions of the security footage was exploitative and violated Tatiane's dignity, while others maintained that the graphic evidence was necessary to educate the public about the reality of domestic violence. The debate highlighted the tension between the public's right to know and the victim's right to privacy. Women's rights organizations used the media attention surrounding Tatiane's case to push for legislative changes and increased funding for domestic violence prevention programs. They argued that her death could have been prevented if better resources and protection had been available to women trying to escape abusive relationships. The case also sparked discussions about the role of neighbors and bystanders in domestic violence situations. Many people who lived in Tatiane's building admitted that they had heard signs of abuse but had chosen not to get involved, raising questions about society's responsibility to protect victims of domestic violence. Legal experts used the case to highlight the importance of security camera evidence in domestic violence prosecutions. They noted that without the video footage, Luís Felipe might have been able to convince a jury that Tatiane's death was suicide, demonstrating how difficult it can be to prove domestic violence cases without clear evidence. The international media also picked up the story, with news outlets around the world using Tatiane's case to examine domestic violence issues in their own countries. The security camera footage was so compelling that it transcended language and cultural barriers, providing a universal illustration of the deadly consequences of domestic abuse. Mental health professionals used the media coverage to educate the public about the psychological dynamics of abusive relationships, explaining why victims often stay with their abusers and why leaving can be the most dangerous time for women in violent relationships. Tatiane's case provided a clear example of how abusers escalate their violence when they feel they are losing control. The media attention also brought scrutiny to the Brazilian legal system's handling of domestic violence cases. Advocates pointed out that while Tatiane's case had clear video evidence, most domestic violence victims do not have such proof and often struggle to get their cases taken seriously by law enforcement and the courts. Some media outlets faced criticism for their coverage of the case, particularly those that focused more on the sensational aspects of the security footage than on the broader issues of domestic violence prevention and victim support. Critics argued that this type of coverage could discourage other victims from seeking help by making them fear public exposure. The sustained media attention ensured that Tatiane's case remained in the public consciousness throughout the legal proceedings, maintaining pressure on the justice system to handle the case appropriately and send a strong message about the consequences of domestic violence. The trial of Luís Felipe Manvailer for the murder of his wife Tatiane began on May 15, 2019, nearly 10 months after her death. The proceedings took place in Guarapuava's criminal court, with Judge Roberto Silva presiding over what had become one of the most closely watched domestic violence cases in Brazilian legal history. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, women's rights advocates, and members of the public who had followed the case since the shocking security camera footage first emerged. The prosecution team led by District Attorney Maria Santos faced the unusual situation of having overwhelming video evidence of the crime, but they still needed to prove that Luís Felipe's actions constituted premeditated murder rather than a crime of passion. They argued that the security footage showed clear evidence of planning, control, and deliberate violence that went far beyond a momentary loss of control. The defendant systematically abused, controlled, and ultimately murdered Tatiane Spitzner in a calculated act of domestic terrorism, Santos argued in her opening statement. The security camera footage shows us the final moments of a woman who was fighting for her life against a man who had decided that if he could uncontrol her completely, he would destroy her. This was not a crime of passion, this was an execution. The prosecution's case was built around three main pillars: the security camera footage, the history of domestic abuse, and the evidence of premeditation. They presented the video evidence carefully, showing only the portions necessary to prove their case, while respecting Tatiane's dignity and the sensitivities of the jury and courtroom observers. The security footage was devastating to any defense strategy. It clearly showed Luís Felipe preventing Tatiane from leaving their apartment, dragging her back when she tried to escape, and ultimately throwing her from the balcony. The audio portion of the recordings captured her screams for help and pleas for mercy, making it impossible to argue that she had died by suicide or accident. Dr. Patricia Santos, the forensic pathologist who had conducted Tatiane's autopsy, testified about the extensive injuries she had suffered before her fall from the balcony. She explained that Tatiane had been severely beaten and tortured before being thrown to her death, contradicting any claim that her death had been the result of a momentary loss of control. The prosecution also presented extensive evidence of the history of abuse in the Manvailer marriage. Former neighbors, colleagues, and family members testified about the signs of domestic violence they had witnessed over the years, painting a picture of systematic abuse that had escalated to murder when Tatiane tried to escape. Digital forensics experts testified about the surveillance software that Luís Felipe had installed on Tatiane's devices, and the evidence that he had been monitoring her communications and planning to prevent her escape. This evidence demonstrated premeditation and showed that he had been preparing for the possibility of killing her if she tried to leave. The defense team, led by attorney Carlos Rodriguez, faced the nearly impossible task of defending a client whose crimes had been captured on video. They attempted to argue that Luís Felipe had been suffering from mental illness and that his actions were the result of a psychological breakdown rather than deliberate murder. "My client was a man in crisis who lost control of his emotions in a moment of extreme stress," Rodriguez argued. While his actions were inexcusable, they were not the calculated murder that the prosecution claims. This was a tragedy born of mental illness, not malice. However, the defense's arguments were severely undermined by the security camera evidence and the extensive documentation of Luís Felipe's planning and preparation. The video footage showed a man who was calm and calculating even in the moments after throwing his wife to her death, contradicting claims of mental breakdown or loss of control. Psychiatric experts who evaluated Luís Felipe found no evidence of mental illness that would have impaired his ability to understand the nature and consequences of his actions. They testified that while he showed signs of narcissistic personality disorder and controlling behavior, he was legally sane and fully responsible for his crimes. The most emotional testimony came from Tatiane's family members, who described the vibrant, intelligent woman whose life had been cut short by domestic violence. Her sister testified about Tatiane's plans to escape her abusive marriage and her fears about what Luís Felipe might do if she tried to leave. Tatiane was trying to save her own life, her sister testified through tears. She knew he was dangerous, and she was planning to leave safely, but he found out about her plans and decided to kill her rather than let her go. She died because she wanted to be free. The trial also featured expert testimony about domestic violence dynamics, helping the jury understand the psychological factors that keep victims trapped in abusive relationships and the escalation patterns that can lead to murder. These experts explained why Tatiane had stayed with her abuser for so long and why her attempt to leave had triggered the final deadly assault. After 2 weeks of testimony and evidence, the case was submitted to the jury for deliberation. The evidence against Luís Felipe was so overwhelming that few observers expected the jury to take long to reach a verdict. But the legal process required careful consideration of all the evidence and testimony presented during the trial, the verdict and sentencing. On May 29, 2019, after deliberating for just over 6 hours, the jury returned a unanimous verdict that would finally bring justice for Tatiane Spitzner and send a powerful message about the consequences of domestic violence in Brazil. Luís Felipe Manvailer was found guilty of qualified homicide with aggravating circumstances, including domestic violence, cruelty, and the use of a method that prevented the victim from defending herself. The reading of the verdict was an emotional moment in the packed courtroom, with Tatiane's family members weeping with relief and gratitude that her killer had been held accountable for his crimes. Women's rights advocates and domestic violence survivors who had followed the case celebrated the verdict as an important victory in the fight against femicide in Brazil. Luís Felipe showed little emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the same cold demeanor that had characterized his behavior throughout the trial and investigation. His lack of remorse or recognition of the gravity of his crimes was noted by observers and seemed to confirm the prosecution's portrayal of him as a calculating and dangerous individual who felt no empathy for his victim. Judge Roberto Silva scheduled the sentencing hearing for the following week, where he would determine the specific punishment that Luís Felipe would receive for his crimes. Under Brazilian law, the qualified homicide conviction carried a potential sentence of 12 to 30 years in prison, with the possibility of additional time for the aggravating circumstances that had been proven during the trial. The verdict was widely celebrated by women's rights organizations and domestic violence prevention advocates, who saw it as an important step forward in holding abusers accountable for their crimes. Many noted that the clear video evidence in Tatiane's case had made conviction easier, but emphasized that most domestic violence victims don't have such compelling proof of their abuse. This verdict sends a clear message that domestic violence will not be tolerated, and that those who abuse and murder women will be held accountable, said Dr. Ana Rodriguez, director of a domestic violence prevention organization. But we must remember that Tatiane's case was unusual because of the video evidence. Most victims don't have cameras to document their abuse, and we must work to ensure that all domestic violence cases are taken seriously by the justice system. The sentencing hearing on June 5, 2019, provided an opportunity for Tatiane's family and friends to address the court about the impact of her murder on their lives and their community. The victim impact statements were powerful and emotional, describing the brilliant, compassionate woman whose life had been cut short by domestic violence. Tatiane was not just a victim, she was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a successful professional who had so much to offer the world. Her mother testified, "Luís Felipe didn't just kill my daughter, he destroyed our family and robbed society of a woman who could have made a real difference in the world. No sentence can bring her back. But we hope that justice will be served and that other women will be protected from similar fates." When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Luís Felipe declined to speak. He offered no apology, no explanation, and no expression of remorse for his actions. His silence was interpreted by many as a final act of disrespect toward the woman he had murdered and the family he had destroyed. Judge Silva sentenced Luís Felipe Manvailer to 30 years in prison, the maximum penalty under Brazilian law for qualified homicide. The judge's sentencing remarks emphasized the severity of the crime and the need to send a strong message about the consequences of domestic violence. The defendant committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, the systematic abuse and murder of his own wife. Judge Silva said, "The security camera footage shows us the true nature of domestic violence and the deadly consequences when control and possession replace love and respect. This sentence reflects society's condemnation of such crimes and our commitment to protecting women from those who would harm them." The 30-year sentence was the maximum possible under Brazilian law, and it ensured that Luís Felipe would spend the majority of his remaining life in prison. The sentence was widely praised by victims' rights advocates and was seen as an important precedent for future domestic violence cases. The legacy, the murder of Tatiane Spitzner, and the subsequent trial of her husband created a lasting impact on Brazilian society that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of her death. Her case became a watershed moment in the country's understanding of domestic violence and sparked significant changes in law enforcement procedures, legal protections for victims, and public awareness of the deadly reality of intimate partner abuse. The security camera footage that captured Tatiane's final moments became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence ever presented in a domestic violence case, providing undeniable proof of the escalation from control to murder that characterizes many abusive relationships. The images forced society to confront the reality that domestic violence is not a private family matter, but a serious crime that can escalate to murder with devastating speed. The case led to significant improvements in how Brazilian law enforcement agencies respond to domestic violence reports. Police departments throughout the country implemented new training programs, focused on recognizing the signs of escalating abuse and understanding the dynamics that make leaving an abusive relationship so dangerous for victims. Legislative changes inspired by Tatiane's case included stronger penalties for domestic violence, expanded definitions of femicide, and improved legal protections for women trying to escape abusive relationships. The case was frequently cited by lawmakers as evidence of the need for more comprehensive approaches to preventing domestic violence and protecting victims. Educational programs about domestic violence began using Tatiane's case as an example of how abuse escalates and why intervention is crucial before violence reaches deadly levels. Her story helped dispel myths about Demessa. The legacy, the murder of Tatiane Spitzner, and the subsequent trial of her husband created a lasting impact on Brazilian society that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of her death. Her case became a watershed moment in the country's understanding of domestic violence and sparked significant changes in law enforcement procedures, legal protections for victims, and public awareness of the deadly reality of intimate partner abuse. The security camera footage that captured Tatiane's final moments became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence ever presented in a domestic violence case, providing undeniable proof of the escalation from control to murder that characterizes many abusive relationships. The images forced society to confront the reality that domestic violence is not a private family matter, but a serious crime that can escalate to murder with devastating speed. The case led to significant improvements in how Brazilian law enforcement agencies respond to domestic violence reports. Police departments throughout the country implemented new training programs focused on recognizing the signs of escalating abuse and understanding the dynamics that make leaving an abusive relationship so dangerous for victims. Legislative changes inspired by Tatiane's case included stronger penalties for domestic violence, expanded definitions of femicide, and improved legal protections for women trying to escape abusive relationships. The case was frequently cited by lawmakers as evidence of the need for more comprehensive approaches to preventing domestic violence and protecting victims. Educational programs about domestic violence began using Tatiane's case as an example of how abuse escalates and why intervention is crucial before violence reaches deadly levels. Her story helped dispel myths about domestic violence, particularly the dangerous misconception that educated, successful women are immune to abuse or that domestic violence only occurs in certain socioeconomic classes. The Tatiane Spitzner Institute, established by her family in her memory, became a leading organization in domestic violence prevention and victim support in Brazil. The institute provides legal assistance, counseling services, and emergency shelter for women trying to escape abusive relationships, ensuring that Tatiane's legacy continues to save lives. Media organizations also changed their approach to covering domestic violence cases, with many outlets developing new guidelines for reporting on intimate partner abuse that focus on education and prevention rather than sensationalism. Tatiane's case demonstrated the power of responsible journalism to create positive social change. The security camera footage, while traumatic to watch, became a powerful tool for educating law enforcement officers, legal professionals, and the general public about the realities of domestic violence. Training programs around the world now use edited portions of the video to illustrate how quickly domestic disputes can escalate to deadly violence. Reflective conclusion: the tragic death of Tatiane Spitzner serves as a stark reminder that domestic violence knows no boundaries of education, wealth, or social status. Here was a successful lawyer, an intelligent and accomplished woman, who should have had every resource necessary to protect herself. Yet she became another victim of the epidemic of violence against women that plagues societies around the world. Tatiane's story is particularly heartbreaking because it was so thoroughly documented. The security cameras that captured her final moments provided the world with an unfiltered view of how domestic abuse escalates, and how quickly control can become murder. The footage eliminated any possibility of denial or victim blaming, forcing society to confront the uncomfortable truth about intimate partner violence. Perhaps most tragically, Tatiane's death was entirely preventable. The warning signs were there: the escalating control, the isolation, the physical violence that had been building for years. But like so many victims of domestic abuse, she was trapped by a combination of fear, shame, economic dependence, and the false hope that her abuser would change. The case exposed the inadequacy of existing systems for protecting domestic violence victims. Despite being an educated professional with resources and legal knowledge, Tatiane was unable to escape her abusive marriage safely. Her death highlighted the need for better support systems, more effective legal protections, and greater societal understanding of the complex dynamics that keep victims trapped in dangerous relationships. Luís Felipe Manvailer's conviction and 30-year sentence represented an important victory for justice, but it came too late to save Tatiane's life. His case demonstrated how abusers often present themselves as loving partners while systematically destroying their victims' independence and self-worth. The security footage revealed the true nature of his character, not a man driven to violence by passion or mental illness, but a calculating predator who saw his wife as property to be controlled or destroyed. The international attention that Tatiane's case received helped shine a spotlight on Brazil's epidemic of violence against women and the broader global crisis of domestic abuse. Her story resonated with women around the world who recognized their own experiences in her struggle to escape an abusive relationship. The changes that have been implemented in response to Tatiane's death: improved police training, Stronger legal protections, better support services for victims represent important progress in the fight against domestic violence. But these improvements came at the cost of her life, serving as a reminder of how much work remains to be done to protect women from intimate partner abuse. Tatiane's legacy is not just the tragedy of her death, but the lives that have been saved by the changes her case inspired. The institute established in her memory, the training programs that use her story, the legal reforms that bear her influence, all of these represent her continuing fight for justice, even after death. The security camera footage that captured Tatiane's murder was difficult to watch, but it served a crucial purpose in educating society about the reality of domestic violence. The images forced viewers to confront the truth that abuse is not about love or passion, but about power and control. They showed that domestic violence can happen to anyone, anywhere, and that it can escalate to murder with shocking speed. In the end, Tatiane Spitzner's story is both a tragedy and a call to action. Her death reminds us that domestic violence is not a private family matter, but a serious crime that requires immediate and comprehensive intervention. Her case challenges us to do better, to recognize the warning signs of abuse, to support victims without judgment, and to hold abusers accountable for their crimes. Tatiane died trying to escape the man who claimed to love her, but who saw her as his possession. Her final moments, captured forever on security cameras, serve as a testament to her courage and a reminder of the deadly consequences when love becomes obsession and marriage becomes prison. Her memory demands that we continue fighting to ensure that no other woman suffers the same fate. The woman who dedicated her life to fighting for justice in the courtroom became, in death, a symbol of the fight for justice for all victims of domestic violence. Her legacy lives on in every woman who finds the courage to leave an abusive relationship, every law that protects victims from their abusers, and every person who refuses to remain silent in the face of intimate partner violence. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel to learn about other cases that highlight the urgent need to combat domestic violence and protect women from those who would harm them. Tatiane's memory deserves nothing less than our complete commitment to creating a world where love never becomes fatal and where every woman can live free from fear.